Within this moment, the role of spirit, whatever it may be, is of paramount importance. Certainly in the university, the question of spirit has often been dismissed as lightweight, unserious, or flighty. It's often contrasted with the easy to grasp, grungy mire of the body, of material culture, or of the apparatus. And yet in the current moment, if it is anything, is a moment of spiritual crisis in many senses. We face a moral crisis, a crisis of community, and most certainly a crisis of ecology and place. Spirit is that ineffable and ephemeral force that is at the heart of what we do, both conceptually and historically. Nietzsche called his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from the spirit of music. The painter Kandinsky wrote an influential treatise that helped to usher in European modernism called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. Max Weber spoke of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The philosopher Hegel famously spoke of the world spirit, which he said was incarnated in Napoleon. And Isabel Allende's first novel was called The House of Spirits. The examples are endless, and each one raises anew the complexity of spirit and the difficulty of speaking about it. To engage these problems, we've invited three guests to join us in conversation today. One of them, Laura Pérez, is a bit late, so she'll join us when she arrives. But I have two of our guests here, and we're delighted to welcome them. They will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we will open the floor to questions, the virtual floor, I should say, to questions from our audience. So feel free to use your chat function on YouTube to make your contribution as we go. Now, let me present our guests today. As I mentioned, we have Laura Pérez, who is not yet here. She's professor of ethnic studies at Berkeley and director of the Latinx Research Center. We also welcome Nick Mathew, professor of music, and John Choctaw, distinguished poet and professor of English. So I would ask each of you to say a few words about how you're here, why you're here, what you think is important, and then maybe we can dig into some more sort of direction-oriented and specific kinds of questions. John, do you want to speak first a bit?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim. I'm very happy to be here, and can't wait for Laura to join us. I've been teaching environmental poetry, and when I find the time, trying to write it. And I have been, like a number of other people, distressed by this pandemic year and our removal from the environment, from the surrounding world, and so thorough a removal through our masking that we even keep the smell of the environment from us. And I think along with the loss, I also sense an opportunity of relinking and reimagining the connection of our species to the environment, something that I think we've lost touch with. One of the words for me then is spirit, one way to do it, but for me, to make that word work, I need it to be lowercase and plural. So I look for spirit of life that we have, but also all the other creatures. It's totally interdependent with bodies, totally interdependent, but it doesn't survive the bodies. The spirits are mortal. And that creates an interesting, for me, kind of relinking or religious attitude among other vital beings. From Genesis, the breath of life was the way to think about the spirit, and God blew blew into the soil, into the nostrils, and this tells me that the breath was scented, and so I'm particularly interested now in the sense of smell as reconnecting with the place, with the plant life, with the animal life. Smell is not, you can't replicate smell. It's not in words, it's beyond words largely. It's not on YouTube, um, and it's intimate. You smell something, the molecules of a wisteria plant or a squirrel enter your nose. It's that intimate. So yeah, these for me are two ways forward. I'll say when it enters the nose, it goes into parts of the brain that fish have or reptiles have. It goes that deep. So it comes back to us, those smells.
Great. So smell turns out to be important. Nick, do you want to talk a bit from your perspective as a musicologist?
Well, most of my work has been on European music of the 18th and 19th century. And there, I don't think that anyone needs to make the case for the connection between music and spirit, since the practitioners themselves were strenuously doing it. And in fact, as in some of my work, the function of music historians in that context is often to expose the opposite of spirit that enables spirit to exist, or the infrastructures within which the idea of spirit can be articulated. And in a sense, that goes for, I think, these days, most music. We don't even need to try and think about the association of music and the spiritual. When Mendelssohn puts religioso at the top of the slow movement of his second symphony, the Lobgesang, it's almost some sort of tautology. It's like, well, of course, religioso. It's, after all, a mid-19th century symphony. And I think when John brings up olfaction, immediately of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, which is not only a joke, based on deodorant, but a riff on the idea that rock and roll and the history of rock and roll is intimately bound up with not just spirit, but spirit perhaps of a particular generation or a particular constituency. When it comes to breath, I think how far back the association of music and spirit goes. And I suppose this is where I would begin to lay out the connection of music and spirit, and perhaps try and make it a little more complicated than music and spirit simply being coterminous. I think of the passage in Descartes' De Passionibus Animae, where he attempts to describe how the animal spirits in the body work, and he draws on an image which is that of the most complex piece of machinery that anyone in those days would have seen on a regular basis, which is the church organ. And in true dualist spirit, he likens the church organ to the body, and the animating spirits that go through it is the breath, the sound, which of course is breath. It needs to be pumped, usually by one of the lesser choristers as the chapel master plays it. So that would seem to imply that music is immaterial, that it's the thing that comes to occupy or to fill out this dead material life. And that suggests, I think, one of our first opposites with spirit, which is matter. Or body, I suppose, would be another one. And yet, on the other hand, of course, music is in some sense the ultimate material art form. It's vibrational, it requires the vibration of bodies, and for that reason, it's often been suspect within precisely the same traditions, which have not only represented music as spirit, but also music as problematic in its relation to the body. It, after all, puts bodies in motion. It makes us dance. It appeals to the senses and the sensual. And in fact, for that reason, music, as we all know, in Plato's Republic, is one of the things that stands in need of regulation, just in case it corrupts the youth of the polis. And I suppose I'd want to see a direct line between, these sort of paradoxes about the at once sort of ineffability and yet brute materiality of music, right through to today's culture of interconnectedness, wherein music, of course, as is often the case, is one of the first art forms that gets gathered up into this process of sharing and distributing art in new media. Where do we store all of our music nowadays? We store it in the cloud. and the cloud sounds very ineffable and immaterial until precisely the moment that you realize that it requires tons of server farms offshore with seawater being pumped into them to keep them cool. So I'd almost want to see that as the sort of end point of a very long history of music's ambivalent relationship with the spiritual.
Great, that's really exciting. So Laura is now with us. Thank you, Laura. We're speaking of spirit. There is such a thing as a departmental spirit. There are good spirits and bad spirits around departments, and Laura's been involved in an external review interview all day. So we hope those were with good spirits and not evil spirits. But anyway, welcome, Laura. So we've just been kind of going around the room, and I asked John and Nick both to sort of talk a little bit about sort of how they come to this problem from their own passions and interests and disciplinary perspectives. So maybe you could introduce yourself a bit. I've introduced you kind of officially already, but talking a little bit about where you come to these kinds of topics and what you're thinking about in this regard.
I never set out to write about the question of spirit or spirituality because it's such a vexed issue. But I also feel that within modern Western culture, it's an especially vexed issue for women to take up. And Mariana Torgovnok wrote about how vexed it was for women. But it's also especially vexed in this kind of intersectional way for people of color and, of course, for women of color. We kind of expect, people of color to have these ideas and relationships to quote unquote shamanism. We kind of expect spirituality to be located in the third world and in people of color, even as at the same time that we've inherited a legacy of understanding the spiritualities and the philosophies of the third world, and which people of color might carry with them now in the first worlds, the so-called first worlds. We nonetheless still view these, especially in university and among the university educated, as like vestiges of, of cultural primitivism, right? And so like one of our challenges in talking about these issues is really thinking about the way that within Western culture, what it has increasingly meant, perhaps until more or less now, right? This epic, I think, but what it is more or less meant to be educated has meant to perform, right? A kind of, very intellectual, objective, distant attitude towards all the materials we study, but certainly towards the things that we cannot measure, right? The things that we cannot classify, right? The things that resist taxonomies, et cetera. And so it's very vexed, as I was saying, to talk about spirit. And then there's a second issue, which is that what people understand by the word that we're using now, spirit, and all of its derivatives, spirituality, et cetera, these things are not universally understood. They're not universals. We need to do a little work, even within one culture itself, across centuries, to kind of be clearer about, do we mean what people in our own cultures meant 6 centuries ago, 5 centuries ago? And of course, within Western Europe, we only need to look at the medieval period to see a real distance, right, in the way in which spirituality was understood. In our pre-meeting, we talked about embodiment. I would hazard that there was a much more embodied approach to reality, even within Western, earlier cultures. But when we're talking about people of color, and I'll only talk about in the United States and not other parts of the world in the so-called first world, it's been really difficult to talk about spirituality and to reclaim it in a way as part of one's own inherited family culture, because it has precisely been viewed as a marker of superstition, right, and of being a little backward. And so to pass intellectually also kind of has required, and I think this is true in general for all of us, and not just people of color, it's kind of required a performance, of our own agnosticism or atheism. And so the kind of work that I do forced upon me, right? As a little model graduate student way back in the day, it really forced upon me something beyond my leftoid skepticisms. I really had to pay attention if I was being objective and not just like sort of selfishly self-preserving as a woman of color. I had to really pay attention to how the various art forms I was looking at, which were experimental writing, performance art, and visual art of various sorts, I had to really pay attention to why these fascinating artists kept on insisting on referring to different kinds of spirituality in their work, you know. And so I began in a very cautious way to sort of being the objective, you know, scholar, to sort of investigate, well, what do they mean? Why is spirituality as important to them as race, gender, sexuality? And what I began to see was that the kind of spirituality that they were referring to was very often a culturally hybrid spirituality, a complex, and I would even say also like a postmodern spirituality. I would even say sometimes a highly even conflictive spirituality, because it also involved the contradictions of appropriations, right? And so what I began to see is that the field of spirituality was fascinating. And frankly, I began to understand that my own fear around investigating spirituality was itself a very telling kind of like sore point, that if I could just tolerate it and look, that I would see something interesting. Why would I, you know, an enlightened feminist, you know, be afraid to think about spirituality? And so, you know, all that I'm saying now is only possible because I went through my own fear and trembling. And so what I have discovered, to cut it short and continue with my companions and to continue with any other Q&A that there might be, is it's really fascinating to me how the way in which various kinds of artists, I mainly look at different types of US Latinx women, also men, especially queer. I also look and focus on and specialize in women of color art and women of color thought from the 60s to the present. And so after these many, many years of studying in these communities, what I find is that the reason that they engage spirituality and the kind of spirituality that they want to invoke and, let's say, recirculate or circulate more broadly is a spirituality that is socially empowering and that is physically, not physically, but that is personally empowering. It's notions of spirituality that I'm teaching a class right now on Latinx religion and philosophy, that we could actually properly call spiritual philosophies. They are ways of thinking about being, about existence, about becoming. And so it isn't a question of whether you or I or any of us here believe what other people believe, in my opinion, but it's rather a question of what the people that I study, for example, just again to refocus on and not generalize for the others, but really it's a question of what the people that I study, what spirituality means to them, and in their communities, how it functions, and that there are different kinds of quote unquote proofs of how spirituality is present and how it is personally empowering, especially around the reconnecting of mind, body, spirit, that in my own thinking is one of the things that in our modern westernized world, we've increasingly kind of lost track of. It's become very difficult to talk about the non-material. It's difficult to talk about emotions, but anything that might be interpreted as psychic, as larger than knowing through the empirically rational, those are difficult things to talk about, admittedly. And so the mind, body, spirit approach that I see in the artists that I work with has to do with also being able to acknowledge that the body knows and that the body experiences, but also that there are ancestors and there are rituals and there are ceremonies and there are ways to connect. So anyway, that's quite a lot, but I'm still fully enmeshed in this research. And the latest thing that I've published is called Eros Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial. And the reason I frame it as an ideology is because these discourses that have to do with relationality, with eros in the broadest sense of the term and not just the sexual, are very much at the heart of Afro-diasporic, Santeria, Yoruba-based, and different indigenous philosophies, especially I'm thinking about Mesoamerican ones that exist today. The idea of respectful relationality, which I think in our language we can call Eros. And so I'm trying to talk about how these types of erotic relationships are social, political, and can be decolonizing. So that certainly was a mouthful.
So that's great. Thanks very much. And I was just thinking, as you were going into that, that if one were to think about the contemporary moment, which you bring to mind, certainly one of the, and the political moment, certainly one of the big spiritual communities in the United States is the evangelical Christian community, which really does live spirituality. I mean, I grew up among evangelical Christians, and where people speak in tongues and engage in activities that the university would not quite know what to do with. I mean, none of our language departments would be able to deal with people speaking in tongues in religious ecstasy. So as you suggested, there is a kind of contextualization here that needs to take place. And I'd like to return to this issue that you mentioned just a minute ago about hybridity. It seems to me that the spiritual does seem to be hybrid. I mean, Nick gave us the example earlier of Descartes vainly trying to sort of point to the spirit in the pipe organ, but spirit seems to be that thing that undoes subject-object relations, mind-body relations. Is this right, or am I misunderstanding?
Was that directed at anyone?
That was directed at everyone, Nick. No one.
In which case, John.
But if you want to speak.
Well, I mean, I could, say it, since Descartes, you mentioned, came up. I mean, Descartes was anxious that the spirit be human and the spirit be immortal. That means no brutes, no animals, no plants in the kingdom of heaven for Descartes. Animal spirits was a way he had of thinking about the non-conscious, non-willful mechanisms of bodies. That for me is where spirits are. That's what makes us living and spirited. And they're inextricable. For me, the poet Natalie Diaz comes to mind. Laura, I don't know if you've read her, but a Mojave poet, but quite interesting. Her recent book, I think, called Post-Colonial Love Song. But Natalie Diaz, totally connects with the animal world beyond her, and that's at the heart of her religious connections. Poets like Gary Snyder do the same. It's not ironic. It's not anything but serious to say, I want to have something of the coyote in me, something of the bear in me. So bring that into my poetics. Yeah.
So since you've just mentioned two West Coast poets, is this a California phenomenon, John? That's not a trick question. I'm asking in all seriousness. Is there a California aesthetic that really wants to bring the spiritual forth?
I've come to think differently about the spirit and the land and my connection since I've moved west. But that's not to exclude East Coast poets like. Of
course, we don't want to exclude our East Coast friends, but just does seem to me that spiritual dimension has flourished in a certain kind of way in a West Coast context. I could be wrong. Laura.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this spirit and nature, because I think that's like it's a really I think you can read poets like throughout time and across cultural traditions, and you will see meditations and connections, moving us beyond our own bodies into a kind of a communing, right, with connecting and identifying with that which is larger than us. And it could just be the mountains, it could just be the redwood forests, etc. Right? But I love that. I also wanted to bring in, as you were asking the question, Tim, I was thinking about how Carl Jung, one of the things that was so interesting. And I think really before his own, he was ahead of his time at a time when Freud was really trying to gain respectability, right, for this new science, psychology. And one of the things that Jung really labored to do throughout his life, and he was more and more open about it the older he got, and that was really trying to like return us as Western human beings or Westernized human beings to experiences that might be much more natural for us. And, of course, for post-structuralist, postmodernist thinking, natural is we all know we have to put it in quotation marks. But what Jung was after was that he really felt that the more modern we were becoming, the more neurotic we were all becoming. And that the more we were becoming like socialized, not quite like Foucault's idea of discipline, but just too socialized, like too many shadows, too much do this, don't do that. And he was much more interested in seeing like human beings like develop in a way where we could discover more what felt natural to us. So natural in that way. He observed and compared us to like animals that were being studied at the time, or insects like worms. Why is it that worms develop a particular way? And so I've always really been struck by that in Jung, this kind of like the question of the mystery of what it is to be human and the mystery of what nature is and the reminder that we are nature, so that being alive is this great question, like who might we be, and especially if we can think a little bit beyond the Pavlovian punishments or rewards. So I like that. I like being able to think about nature and spirit or soul, the root of psyche, right? As Jung reminded us.
So a word that has not been mentioned yet is the word sacred. And I was wondering if we could think about, again, I return to you, Nick, because I always think about music in this context. We think of sacred music. I mean, you mentioned Mendelssohn earlier, but is there a moment at which music becomes sacred even when it's no longer sacred?
Well, of course, the spiritual is a musical genre.
Right.
It occurs to me, listening to Lara talk about Carl Jung and Freud and deep psychoanalysis more generally, that one of the implications that one could draw from their work is a sort of adaptation of the Latourian formula, that we have never been secular. And actually, it's possible that that the idea that this Weberian disenchantment happened as a result of a particular kind of European capitalist modernity is itself one of these self-serving fictions. And as Lara and John have both pointed out, that despite its apparent imperialism, there is a persistence, and again, this is a psychoanalytic as much as any other revelation, a persistence of an investment in what we could call the spiritual life, institutionally, in terms of our personal practices, in terms of our political practices, and so on. And actually, the music's a pretty interesting case, I think, there, because, on the one hand, and again, I think if you're mentioning California here, we're dealing with dangerously appropriative models of quote unquote non-Western practices that, particularly in the history of Californian politics, have supposedly renewed our barren, disenchanted spiritual lives in the form of yoga and meditation and things that are instinctively identified often with indigenous forms of knowledge and so on and so forth, not mistakenly, but however often quite crudely. And that's behind, very distinctive capitalist cultures of holism and things like that. And in these, music has had a huge role, not least in California. I mean, of course, the great Bay Area resident Pauline Oliveros is one example, whose very notion of deep listening was fundamentally ecological, and who started her spiritual journeys precisely with the body. Works like Teach Yourself to Fly are precisely about developing a kind of communal music from what she took to be the natural rhythms of the body. So, these, again, distinctively Californian practices in some ways, trying to renew art practice with a spirituality that is supposed to be, in some sense, non-Western or non-European. Because the category of the sacred is itself more complicated. And this is something that the work of one of my students, Desmond Sheehan, has shown really quite brilliantly, which is that the idea of sacred music became possible when media infrastructures and institutions were rearranged at a certain point in the early 19th century. In other words, when sacred music didn't happen in one particular spot or for a particular liturgical function, but was now dispersed into all corners of big metropolis, like somewhere such as Berlin. It should be no surprise to us that it was in Berlin that Friedrich Schleiermacher, the great theologian, philosopher, and part-time musician, invented the idea of art religion. You know, the notion that art itself, and you get this then right the way through Romantic philosophy, is itself a form of religious revelation, and that one can have a sacred or spiritual experience in a concert hall or listening through one's headphones just as easily as one could at a sacred place or during actual liturgy. And I suppose that goes again into two different directions, this renewal of some idea of a European or Euro-American tradition through these non-European sites. I think of also in Berlin, the first generation of comparative musicologists, Stumpf and Hornbost, or very famously, Max Müller's Sacred Books of the East. You know, these were projects that were focused on producing some universal idea of the sacred that then required these researchers to leave Europe to go find it. They didn't really believe it was there anymore. And in a sense, and this is sort of, I suppose, one of the end points of what I have to say here, this is revived by a generation of ecologically minded artists, such as R. Murray Schafer, and that generation of sort of Canadian environmental activists in their notion of the soundscape, which is an attempt, as it were, to sort of remake what they regarded as a fractured relationship between sound and environment. And in fact, he decried what he called schizophonia, this sort of schizophrenic division of sound from source, and regarded these precious soundscapes as things that stood in need of protection, maybe even stewardship, much as one would the natural environments within which these sounds flourished. And that's probably been the most influential idea on the next generation of new materialists, for whom, you know, music and vibration and the sort of relational model, the sort of ecological relational model, is centrally important.
So thinking about what you're saying also in the context of what Laura is saying, it seems to me that one way to think about the sacred is in some way to think around it, to think about its if you think of the soundscape, which is as a kind of ensemble of sounds, not one thing happening, but all of those things happening together, or a certain practice that would be embedded in a particular culture at a particular moment, that cannot be isolated in the kind of Western European analytical tradition. So that sense of ensemble or community, now I'm creeping into another loaded term by using the word community, but that sense of a kind of ensemble or context seems to be one way to get closer to thinking about spirit, possibly, right?
I think spirit needs the profane as well as the sacred. It needs to be out of the temple and not exclusive, but inclusive. That's how we relate to what's beyond. I mean, that would be my immediate sense of things.
I think I agree. I think this is like super interesting, right? Because I think part of what I think I heard you say, Nick, is, you know, that there's sort of like we see this moment when like Europeans, you know, are have a sense of losing their religion, right? You know, and so then searching for it in all kinds of places. And today we're in this place where maybe people, and I want to say highly educated people, including artists, are maybe finding it safe to get their spiritual fix in environmentalism. I would say that, like, in the, you know, in the prior period, people got their spiritual fix by caring about each other and becoming political activists, right? Where you didn't have to identify spiritually, but of care and a practice of connection and a practice of stewardship. And I think what's so fascinating is I remember when I used to hear all the criticisms about, oh, well, we have all these new agers appropriating all of these things. And of course, I think that many of those things were true. But what I thought was even more interesting, you know, not to minimize the rest, but I couldn't help it. What I thought was interesting is that I thought that what that represented as well was like thirst. It represented a search, you know, like a trying to fashion a way to express something that that Jung, again, trying to defend himself from his like Freudian colleagues at the time, said, look, my connection to spirituality, you know, is that if you look at humanity, that you see a function. You know, humans dream, you see that across cultures. Humans, you know, form certain kinds of relationships, you see that across culture. And he said there's a kind of a God function that humans have, their idea. It could be one God, it could be many gods, but that seemed to characterize what it is to be human. And so I think that's interesting, because if that's true, then we've kind of, what is the relationship, speaking of Weber, right, of industrialism, of capitalism, of the necessity for us to be efficient, to produce material objects? You know, actually, we kind of need to murder our conscience if we're going to be really good, productive citizens. And we need to kind of murder our feelings if we're going to allow ourselves to become even super productive academics. So I think that it is not a crazy question to say, what is the work that happens when we repress talk of spirit and sacred from whatever cultures we approach it, you know?
I feel like not doing any more work for a while, at least. After that, could we talk about, since we're talking about the university or institutionality, could we talk a little bit about place? I mean, we have this famous phrase, spirit of place. There is a kind of sense of a spirituality that's linked to place. In fact, we got a comment from someone in our audience pointing out that in California, it's easy for us to imagine that nature is benevolent, right? So, whereas in northern Minnesota, one might have a different view to nature. But could we talk a little bit about place? I mean, the spirit does seem to be connected to place. Certainly in the classical Greek tradition, which is one I know a little bit about, there were sort of local gods, so on and so forth. There kind of are everywhere. Could we think a little bit more about that sense of place?
I don't know, Nick, if it's your turn in this wheel.
Well, I would say that it's very interesting thinking about what Lara suggested about academic respectability with respect to spirituality, in part because the university is a consecrated space, you know, and part of what it does is takes knowledges that have one function in the world outside and reprocess them into different kinds of knowledge, or more respectable kind of knowledge. You know, sometimes it cleanses them, or we do our various incantations over these forms of knowledge, and they emerge very differently. And actually, I suppose that's one of the definitions of the sacred at all, is that it has to be alive with space. You know, Victor Turner taught us this about ritual, that it's closely associated with particular consecrated spaces and what happens there. And you know, one hardly needs to explain that in the history of art, particularly in Europe, and the strong vision of art with a capital A, is fundamentally bound up with the production of consecrated spaces in which one can have, and I'm thinking again of what Lara just said, these sort of controlled explosions of spirituality, as it were, whether that's inside the frame of a painting, whether that's across the threshold of a museum, or whether that's through the lobby of a concert hall. I think one of the interesting things about music, and perhaps why it's become a little bit of a master metaphor, or some sort of master trope of more relational, vibrational, new materialist conceptions of kind of ecology, is that it doesn't sit very well with place. Music leaks out very easily, rather like John's olfaction. It goes in It actually crosses bodies. It tends to confuse subject and object as everyone vibrates together. And to that extent is an excellent metaphor for placelessness or interconnection or mobility or actually deterritorialization as much as a sort of a powerful locatedness. And that's a paradox that's proved very useful, I think, in the history of music.
So sound and smell would be the two senses we'd want to think about here.
I would
Returning to John's opening comment, right?
I would say places often have their own characteristic smells. I grew up in a drained swamp, which had not forgotten it was a swamp. It was the place of black bears. Bears have the most keen sense of smell of any animal, I believe. And it would be the smell of decay. And I think Nicholas is right that these are often consecrated places where people would go for a sense of strength and community from what was beyond them. That it could be even curative in that sense. And I certainly know what it's like to go somewhere to feel better, to get back to something that's something I'm not ashamed to confess. And often, it does have to do with smell. I recognize a swamp smell. I know what that is. Just as now I recognize what a wisteria, or what was this, a wisteria or lilac? What did you?
Lilacs.
Lilacs, yeah.
Yes.
So these are fundamental, and you're right that they're ill-defined. They're ill-defined. You call it place, you call it placelessness because it's ambient. And when there's the cloud, talk about the cloud. That's the cloud, the olfactory plume that floats up. And where are we? We're at least there.
So I'm not. Yes, go ahead.
Can I just continue on this little thread? So you asked us about spirit and place. And I was thinking about how, sort of, John, you just kind of also touched on it when you talked about our special places. I was thinking about altars, right? And I've done a lot of thinking about altars because artists have done altar installations. They've made altar films. They've, just explored what altar means in so many ways. And I think that after many, many years of thinking about what is an altar, I think the general response that I seem to have collected was that it's an intentional space where we invoke. And in a secular way, it could be an intentional space where we invoke memories, right? Where we invoke feelings. These are immaterial things. But also, when I think about real spiritual rituals, it's where we invoke deities, of certain types, in a certain type of encounter. But I also thought, ultimately an altar is really a representation of the human being, because in those spiritual traditions that I have been studying, we are the real crossroads, right, of the presence of not only spirit, but of deity, whatever that deity may be to us, right, of the gods or God. We are embodied in those philosophies, spiritual philosophies. We are embodied sacred energy. So where is the sacred? From that perspective, which I know is not everyone's perspective, it's like the sacred is everywhere. And we are definitely a part of that everywhere, even though we may also create spaces for ourselves or find them where there's a saturation of energy or a saturation of intention, right?
Yes. I sense that John's about to speak. Are you going to speak, John?
Well, I was curious about chats or comments coming in. I know.
So we do have some comments coming in. One was about proximity. This goes back in some way to your insights about smell, John, which was, and as we've been talking about place, I've been thinking about the fact that none of us in the same place, and yet we're having a conversation here. And I can't smell anything. I certainly can't smell those flowers that Laura's got in her
Right.
place, or the coffee that Nick is sipping from. So the question was, do we need a certain kind of proximity? This is from someone in our audience. Do we need a certain sense of proximity to connect with a sense of spirit and a sense of community? I mean, is it possible to do that without being close in some kind of way? I'm thinking back to God breathing the breath into Adam back with which we began in John's opening comments. So is spirit involved proximity? Can we be spirit? Can one be spiritual on MTV? Be the question.
Well, someone else can speak about televangelism, but yeah, proximity. I believe in that. I believe in getting the senses of the place, and also to be sensed by other creatures.
Yeah.
So I think if you can walk out in there, then and be there, then I think you can also take that back to your composing room.
Mm-hmm.
I think of someone like John Luther Adams, who was thinking about the Sonoran Desert or the Pacific Ocean or the rivers even of his childhood, I guess Mississippi. So, but he would take it back with him and yeah, make something, bring us closer there. So I like that idea of proximity.
One of the reasons Immanuel Kant didn't like music very much wasn't just because he was probably a rank amateur, but because you couldn't shut it off. That it went in no matter what. You couldn't close your ears as you close your eyes. And apparently there was always a trumpeter or a marching band practicing and just under his window as he tried to finish which critique he was trying to finish up. And actually that's often been taken as somehow paradigmatic, that sound is immersive, right? That it's all around you, it's non-directional. And that may or may not be true depending on the mediated circumstances. But I do think that this current condition that we're in shows that you can, and after all, anyone who bought a Sony Walkman in the 80s should know this, sound can actually be piped directionally really straight to you, and even more so these days, even as sound sort of remains this, as I've said a couple of times previously, this sort of master trope of dispersion and connectedness. And I do wonder, I mean, I, like John and Laura too, I'm sure, not only am I feeling very nostalgic for what the movie In the Loop called Room Meat, just other fleshy bodies in the same space. But I think, for example, it's become increasingly commonplace, I'm glad to see these days, to preface talk or concerts. I've seen this all over the world, but particularly in settler colonial societies, with reminding everybody whose land that we're on, and reminding that property is an invention of a certain kind of colonialism. But I tend to think now that the one thing that we're not calling out, the ownership that we're not calling out, is the small group of dudes who own the interfaces over which we're currently speaking. that those spaces often we don't describe who they are. We don't describe who owns Zoom, what the property relations are, as what are the material conditions that that actually produce the possibility of our knowing each other still. And that makes me pretty suspicious, I have to say. So even as, of course, we're all incredibly grateful for this new period of connectedness, I would like to think that there is something better about being in the same space, not merely because of some ecology of the senses, but also because this is a very strange and very specific form of media we're experiencing right now.
But to return to, it is indeed, and I appreciate the fact that we don't have to acknowledge Google, but when we begin an event, at least not yet, we're not at that point yet. They may begin requiring it. But I wonder what it is that that this imposes on us in the university. I'm thinking a little bit about, I always want to think about the university, and we seem to be losing something in this moment. But does our interest in spirit, does the work that we do as musicologists or poets or scholars of visual culture provide a kind of resource for us to respond to this current moment? That would be the question. I mean, beyond this conversation.
I'll just jump in and just say that for me, the study of spirituality in various kinds of art practices over time have kind of made it okay, for me to sort of like become more in touch with my own spirituality, by whatever name that goes, right? And with my own curiosity about my own like larger than just rational brain self, and to also try to really think about what it means for the body to speak, because for some people, for the body to speak is the way our spirit or our soul speaks. And I think that this period, which has been so horrible, because also speaking as a Chicana in the state of California with so many, I teach so many students who have been directly affected. I work with colleagues who at the beginning of this, we were all talking about how much our students were suffering and their families. And now more and more, it's our own families as well, And so, this has just been a really dreadful time. And I think whenever there are catastrophes, like the kinds of catastrophes we've been living, COVID, the reemergence of white supremacism, the lack of compassion for Black Lives Matter and other bodies of color right now, the anti-Asian attacks that are happening, the violence. These are just awful times. And yet, we're trapped in our houses, so many of us. And one of the things that I think can come out of that, whether we consider ourselves spiritual or not, maybe we just think about life, we're reflective, we're philosophical, or we're thinkers, is to reflect, to kind of go inside a little bit more, to kind of listen to ourselves a little bit more. To me, those are practices of spirituality, to listen to ourselves, to not rush so much and see what's coming up, and expressing the grief of this moment and the gratitude that we have when we can be with each other. And that, that Zoom allows us to at least see the faces of our students really close. There's a closeness that has also been created for me in teaching. So I think that that studying spirituality can also put us more in touch with our own quote unquote, spirituality, and hopefully become more compassionate with ourselves too.
We had an interesting conversation earlier in the year on performance, and we were thinking about the way, because performance is one of the first things that we've lost, certainly. Live performance, musical performance, dramatic performance, and so on. And we were talking with San Kwan, who's a dancer in TDPS, and she was talking about the way in which working online, I would think that teaching dance would be like the first thing that would go, that you would never be able to teach dance. I mean, you can't jump around and, whatever you want to do and interact. She was talking about the ways in which there emerged new techniques of teaching, that she teaches certain kinds of gestures. She teaches use of the hands and wrists and the arms, various kinds of movements, which in a normal class, pre-pandemic class, they never would have paid any attention to in the classroom, because they're worried about, jumping up and down and being in the right place on the stage and who's interacting with what. But now, because there's a different kind of experience which is imposed on them, there's a much more intimate and in some ways a much more delicate and nuanced way of thinking about movement that the pandemic moment in some way brings to the fore. I thought that was a really interesting observation. And it seems to me that we could apply it to any number of kinds. I mean, Laura, it seems to me that's one of the things that you're suggesting, that the isolation and the silence and the slowness that the current moment has imposed on us should generate a certain kind of thinking about spirit and and what its many manifestations might be. That's just my observation.
Thinking about animal performance,
Yeah.
namely sexual displays, they need an audience. Birds, even when they're performing in communities, and it's often dance as well as
Yes.
song, and sense is often much involved. Yeah, they need an audience. It does
They
not
need an
happen otherwise. And I'll say that the space is prepared. That's the first thing for an animal display,
Right.
is to prepare it, clean it, because that will be observed as well.
Yeah.
If you haven't taken care of your place, the female audience will check out, and you have lost in your competition.
We didn't plan it this way, John, but that's an absolutely perfect way to end this conversation because we're out of time. Thinking about performance, preparing your place, having your audience, turning to your own concerns, and performing for your community or your mate. So I want to thank all three of you, Laura, Nick, and John. This has been a fantastic conversation, and thanks to all of you out there in Zoom land for tuning in, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
It was a pleasure to be here with all of you.